Mom, Jessica comes first now. Those 7 words changed the way I saw my son forever. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply sat there at the dining room table, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee in front of me while something deep inside my chest quietly cracked. Looking back now, I realized that moment didn't destroy our relationship. It only revealed what had already been true for years. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, a widow, and the mother of 1 son. For most of my life, I believed family was something you protected. You showed up. You forgave. You sacrificed. And if you loved hard enough, the people you loved would eventually do the same for you. At least, that's what I believed until that Sunday afternoon. It had started like countless other family gatherings. The kind I had spent decades organizing. The kind where I cooked too much food because I always worried someone might leave hungry. The kind where I carefully folded cloth napkins, even when paper ones would have worked just fine. Old habits are hard to break, especially when those habits are tied to love. The sunlight streamed through my kitchen windows that afternoon, warming the hardwood floors. A roast sat in the oven. Fresh rolls cooled on the counter. I had even made Ethan's favorite peach cobbler from scratch. He was 41 now, but some part of me still remembered the little boy who used to run into the kitchen asking if dessert was ready before dinner had even started. Jessica arrived first. She always did. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect manners. The kind of woman people instantly liked. She kissed my cheek and complimented the flowers on the table. She asked how I was feeling. She thanked me for cooking. Anyone watching would have thought I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law like her. For years, that's exactly what I told myself. Ethan came in a few minutes later carrying a bottle of wine. He hugged me quickly before settling beside Jessica. Nothing seemed unusual at first. We talked about the weather, gas prices, their upcoming vacation, the neighbors across the street who had finally sold their house. Ordinary conversation, comfortable conversation, the kind that makes you believe everything is fine. Then I made a mistake. At least that's what they treated it like. Jessica mentioned they were considering moving farther from town, nearly 2 hours away. My smile faded. That's quite a drive, I said gently, especially if you're planning to have children someday. The room grew quiet. Not awkward, just different, as if I had stepped into a conversation where I no longer belonged. Jessica exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. A glance so brief most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. Mothers notice things. We'll figure it out, Jessica said politely. Of course, I replied. I just meant family support matters when life gets busy. Before I could say another word, Ethan leaned forward. His expression wasn't angry. Somehow that made it worse. Mom, he said calmly. Jessica and I make decisions together. I nodded. I know that. Then trust us to make them. There was something final in his voice. Something rehearsed. I felt my stomach tighten. I do trust you, I said softly. I'm only sharing a thought. Jessica reached for his hand beneath the table. Ethan squeezed it immediately. Then he looked directly at me. Mom, Jessica comes first now. The words hung in the air between us. Simple words. Reasonable words, maybe. But it wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Like he was drawing a line. Like he was choosing a side in a conflict I didn't even know existed. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The roast continued cooking in the kitchen. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the block. Life kept moving while my world quietly shifted beneath my feet. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. And for the rest of that dinner, I pretended everything was normal. But as I cleared the plates later that evening and watched their car disappear down the street, a question settled heavily in my mind. When had my son stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle? I didn't know it then, but that question was about to uncover a truth I had spent years refusing to see. The question followed me for days. I carried it with me through quiet mornings and long afternoons, through grocery store aisles and evening walks around my neighborhood. When had Ethan stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Because once I allowed myself to ask that question honestly, other memories began rising to the surface. Small moments, ordinary moments, moments I had dismissed at the time because they seemed too insignificant to matter. A week after that dinner, I was sitting in my living room sorting through old photographs when my phone buzzed. A picture message from my sister Carol appeared on the screen. She and her husband had spent the weekend at a lake resort about an hour outside the city. I smiled as I opened the image, expecting to see a sunset or a fishing boat. Instead, I froze. There was Ethan. There was Jessica. They were standing beside Carol on a wooden dock, smiling at the camera. For a moment, I simply stared. Then I checked the date. The photograph had been taken the day before. I felt confused more than hurt. Ethan and Jessica had never mentioned any trip. In fact, I had spoken to Ethan 3 days earlier. He had told me they were staying home because work had been exhausting. I looked at the photograph again. Everyone seemed relaxed. Happy. Included. Everyone except me. I set my phone down and tried to convince myself it did not matter. They were adults. They were allowed to travel. They did not need my permission. But that was not really what bothered me. What bothered me was that nobody had thought to tell me. Later that evening, I called Carol. During our conversation, she casually mentioned how much fun everyone had shared around the fire pit after dinner. Everyone. The word lingered in my mind. Everyone. Not once did she realize I had not been there. Not once did she suspect I had not even known about the trip. After we hung up, I walked into the kitchen and stood by the sink. The house felt unusually quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. I suddenly remembered another afternoon several months earlier. Ethan and Jessica had hosted a barbecue in their backyard. I had only discovered it happened because one of my neighbors had seen photographs online and asked how much fun I had. At the time, Ethan apologized and claimed it had been a last-minute gathering. I believed him. Then another memory surfaced. Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. Jessica had insisted they wanted a quiet holiday at home. I spent the day alone, heating a frozen turkey dinner and watching old movies. A week later, I learned they had hosted a full dinner for friends and several relatives. Jessica explained there had not been enough room. I accepted that explanation too. Looking back, I realized how often I had accepted explanations. How often I had chosen comfort over truth. The pattern was impossible to ignore once I saw it. It was never one dramatic rejection. It was 100 tiny exclusions. 100 small reminders that my presence was becoming optional. What troubled me most was not Jessica's behavior. She had entered the family as an outsider. Her loyalties belonged to her own future. What troubled me was Ethan, my son, the boy I had raised alone after his father passed away. The boy whose school projects I helped build on the kitchen table. The boy whose college tuition I worked extra years to help pay. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing when I was left behind. Or perhaps he noticed and decided it was easier not to say anything. That possibility hurt far more than I wanted to admit. As the evening grew darker, I sat alone in my favorite chair by the window. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one. Families gathered inside warm homes. Laughter drifted faintly through the cool air. I stared at the reflection in the glass and began to wonder if the truth had been standing in front of me for years while I kept looking the other way. Over the next few weeks, I found myself revisiting memories I had not thought about in years. Not the big milestones that fill photo albums and holiday cards. The smaller moments. The quiet conversations. The forgotten details. Those were the memories that seemed different now. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I pulled an old storage box from the hall closet. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, school drawings, and dozens of handwritten notes Ethan had given me over the years. I sat at the dining room table turning each item over carefully. A second-grade Mother's Day card made me smile. The letters were crooked and oversized. He had written that I was his best friend and that he wanted us to live next door to each other forever. I laughed softly at that. Children make promises they cannot possibly understand. Yet something about those words stayed with me long after I put the card aside. Later that evening, another memory surfaced. Jessica's first Thanksgiving with our family nearly 10 years earlier. She had been nervous. I remembered how tightly she held Ethan's hand when she walked through my front door. I remembered making extra dishes because Ethan told me she was a picky eater. I remembered buying flowers in her favorite color after learning she felt uncomfortable meeting everyone at once. Back then, I genuinely wanted her to feel welcome. She was not replacing anyone. She was becoming family. For the first few years, things seemed fine. We had lunches together. We exchanged birthday gifts. We spent holidays around the same table. Looking back, I realized the changes happened so gradually that I barely noticed them. Jessica never demanded attention. She never caused scenes. Instead, she operated quietly. If a family gathering conflicted with her plans, the gathering changed. If a holiday tradition did not interest her, the tradition disappeared. If Ethan wanted to spend time with me, there always seemed to be another obligation waiting. At the time, I told myself that marriage required compromise. What I never asked was who kept doing all the compromising. One Saturday morning, while organizing old emails on my computer, I came across a message Ethan had sent years earlier. It was nothing important, just a short note thanking me for helping him move into his first apartment. But I noticed something strange. The date. The message had been sent almost 6 years ago, around the same time Jessica entered his life. I continued scrolling through older emails. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Before Jessica, Ethan called often. He shared stories. He asked questions. He checked in for no reason at all. After Jessica, the messages became shorter, less personal, more practical. At first, I felt guilty for noticing. It seemed unfair. People grow older. Lives become busier. Relationships change. But deep down, I knew this was different. Distance had not appeared naturally. It had accumulated one decision at a time. One overlooked invitation. One canceled visit. One ignored phone call. The realization settled heavily over me. Not because it was shocking, but because it explained so much. I had spent years believing the problem was temporary. That eventually things would return to normal. That if I remained patient enough, helpful enough, understanding enough, everything would work itself out. Sitting alone in my dining room that night, I finally accepted something painful. There was no normal to return to. The relationship I missed no longer existed. And the hardest part was knowing I had been trying to save it alone. About a month later, an opportunity arrived when I least expected it. My granddaughter Lily was turning 12, and Ethan called to invite me to her birthday party. The invitation itself surprised me. Over the previous year, most family events seemed to reach me as an afterthought. This time, Ethan sounded almost enthusiastic. I agreed immediately. For several days, I allowed myself to feel excited. I bought Lily the art set she had been asking for. I wrapped it carefully in bright paper covered with tiny paintbrushes and colorful stars. The morning of the party, I arrived 15 minutes early, just as I always had. Old habits. The house buzzed with activity. Children ran through the backyard. Music drifted from a speaker near the patio. Balloons swayed gently in the warm breeze. Jessica greeted me with a smile and thanked me for coming. Everything seemed normal. At first, I carried the gift inside and placed it on a table already crowded with presents. Then I noticed something odd. A large display board stood near the kitchen entrance. It was covered with family photographs from the past year. Beach trips, school events, holiday gatherings, weekend outings. I stepped closer. My smile slowly faded. I was not in a single photograph. Not one. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I continued looking. There were dozens of pictures. Ethan and Jessica, Lily and her younger brother, cousins, friends, even distant relatives I barely knew. Yet somehow, I was absent from every image. The realization settled quietly over me. Nobody else seemed to notice. Children laughed nearby. Guests chatted around the food table. Life continued normally while I stood there studying a year of memories that apparently did not include me. A little later, I found myself sitting beside Lily as she opened gifts. She hugged me when she saw the art set and thanked me warmly. Her happiness was genuine, and for a moment, it eased the heaviness in my chest. Then she said something she never intended to hurt me with. "Grandma, I wish you could come with us more often." I smiled gently. "What do you mean?" She looked surprised. "You know, like all the trips." My heart skipped. "What trips?" Lily began listing places. A mountain cabin, a summer festival, a weekend at the lake, a baseball game in another city. She described them casually, unaware that each sentence revealed another event I had never heard about. Children tell the truth without realizing it. There is no strategy behind it. No hidden agenda. Just simple honesty. I listened quietly while Lily talked. Every new detail felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. By the time the party ended, I was emotionally exhausted. Driving home, I replayed the conversation again and again. The road stretched ahead beneath the fading orange light of sunset. Traffic moved steadily around me. My hands remained calm on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were anything but calm. For years, I had blamed misunderstandings, scheduling conflicts, busy lives, different priorities. Now those explanations felt increasingly hollow. Too many events, Too many exclusions. Too many moments that happened without me. When I arrived home, I carried my purse inside and sat at the kitchen table. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I thought about Lily's innocent comment. I thought about the display board full of photographs. Most of all, I thought about how natural all of it seemed to everyone else. That was the part one could not ignore. Nobody appeared concerned that I was missing. Nobody questioned my absence. Somewhere along the way, being left out had become normal. And for the first time, I began wondering whether someone had worked very hard to make sure it happened that way. 3 days after Lily's birthday party, I received a phone call that changed everything. The call came from Carol. At first, it sounded like one of our usual conversations. We talked about the weather, a neighbor who had recently moved away, and a new coffee shop that had opened downtown. Then her voice shifted. It became quieter, more careful. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," I replied. There was a pause. "Are you and Ethan doing all right?" The question caught me off guard. I stared out the kitchen window at the bird feeder hanging near the fence. "Why would you ask that?" Another pause followed, long enough to make my stomach tighten. "Because Jessica says you prefer being alone these days." I felt a strange chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight filling the room. "What do you mean?" I asked. Carol hesitated again. "I thought you knew." I listened carefully as she explained. Over the past couple of years, Jessica had repeatedly told relatives that I was slowing down, becoming less social, and choosing not to attend many family activities. According to Jessica, invitations had always been offered. According to Jessica, I simply preferred staying home. Carol sounded genuinely confused. "I always assumed that was your decision," she said. She made it sound like that was what you wanted. I closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly, dozens of confusing situations began making sense. Family members had stopped asking why I missed events because they believed I had declined. They assumed my absence was my own choice. Nobody questioned it because they trusted the explanation they had been given. After we hung up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time. The clock above the stove ticked. Steadily, cars passed outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything around me felt normal, while my understanding of the last several years shifted completely. Later that evening, I opened my laptop and logged into an old family group chat that I rarely used anymore. Most conversations had become quieter over the years, but the message history remained. I began scrolling backward. At first, nothing stood out. Then I noticed something. A cousin had once suggested a family picnic at a state park. Before I could even respond, Jessica had written, "Margaret is probably going to sit this one out. She likes her quiet weekends." My stomach tightened. I kept reading. A few months later, another relative invited everyone to a holiday market downtown. Again, before I had answered, Jessica replied, "Margaret does not really enjoy crowds anymore." Then another message. Then another. Different events. Different dates. The same pattern. Jessica answering for me. Jessica explaining my absence before I had spoken. Jessica gently shaping how others saw me. None of the messages sounded cruel. That was what made them so effective. They sounded helpful, reasonable, caring, even. Yet every one of them quietly moved me farther away from the family. I stared at the screen long after midnight. The evidence was sitting right in front of me. Not rumors. Not assumptions. My own eyes reading years of conversations I had barely noticed before. The realization settled heavily over me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a narrative. A story repeated often enough that everyone accepted it as fact. And for the first time, I found myself wondering something that frightened me even more than Jessica's behavior. How much of this had Ethan seen without ever questioning it? For several days after reading those old messages, I could not stop thinking about one question. How much of this had Ethan seen? Had he noticed Jessica answering for me? Had he seen those comments in the family chat? Or had he simply stopped paying attention long ago? I needed answers, but I did not want a confrontation. I wanted clarity. So I decided to do something simple. The following week, I called Ethan and invited him to lunch. Just the two of us. No special occasion. No hidden agenda. To my surprise, he agreed immediately. We met at a small diner we used to visit when he was younger. The place had hardly changed over the years. The same red booths. The same coffee mugs. The same smell of bacon and fresh biscuits drifting from the kitchen. For a while, our conversation stayed comfortably on the surface. We talked about work, Lily's latest school project, and a baseball game Ethan had recently attended. Then I gently shifted the conversation. Carol told me about the family picnic last month, I said. Ethan smiled. Yeah, it was a good day. I nodded. I wish I had known about it. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Jessica said you were not interested, he replied. I looked down at my coffee cup. Did she? He shrugged. She said you liked having your weekends to yourself. The answer sounded automatic, as though he had repeated it many times before. I let the silence linger for a moment. Then I asked quietly, did you ever ask me? Ethan blinked. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. I guess I never thought to. The honesty hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it was careless. Before I could respond, a familiar voice interrupted us. Margaret. I turned and saw Aunt Diane standing near the entrance. She was carrying a takeout bag and looked genuinely pleased to see me. After exchanging greetings, she joined us for a few minutes. The conversation drifted naturally toward family gatherings. Then Diane said something neither Ethan nor I expected. I always felt bad that you stopped wanting to be involved. I frowned. What do you mean? Diane looked surprised. Jessica told everyone years ago that you wanted more space from family events. She said you were trying to simplify your life. The table fell silent. Diane continued speaking, unaware of the effect her words were having. I remember hearing that at Thanksgiving. Then again at your cousin's retirement party. Honestly, we all thought it was your choice. I glanced at Ethan. He was staring at the table. Diane eventually left, but her words remained. The moment felt different from Carol's phone call. Carol had provided a clue. Diane provided confirmation. The same explanation. The same story. Repeated to different people across different years. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A carefully maintained narrative. After Diane left, Ethan sat quietly for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I never realized she was telling everyone that. I studied his face. He seemed genuinely unsettled. Yet another realization settled over me. The problem was no longer whether Ethan knew. The problem was that he had never cared enough to check. As lunch ended, I felt strangely calm. The truth was no longer hidden. Piece by piece, it was revealing itself. And for the first time, I began to understand that some people create distance through words, while others create it through silence. The following month, I made a decision that would have been impossible for me just a year earlier. I stopped chasing the relationship. I did not make an announcement. I did not send emotional messages. I did not confront anyone. I simply stepped back. For years, I had been the one keeping everything connected. I remembered every birthday. I mailed every card. I called first. I checked in. I organized holiday dinners. I bought gifts for school events. I offered help before anyone asked for it. It had become such a normal part of my life that I never stopped to wonder what would happen if I quietly stopped. So I did. When Lily's birthday came around, I sent a thoughtful gift, but did not call to ask about the party plans. When Thanksgiving approached, I waited to see if anyone would invite me. I did not volunteer to host. I did not offer to cook. I simply waited. Days passed, then weeks. At first, nothing happened. My phone remained unusually quiet. Ethan sent an occasional text about the weather or a sporting event. Jessica did not contact me at all. The silence told me more than any argument ever could. One Saturday morning, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee and realized something surprising. I felt calmer. For the first time in years, I was no longer measuring my worth by how included I felt in someone else's plans. Instead of waiting for invitations, I started saying yes to opportunities that had nothing to do with my family. I joined a local book club. I attended community events. I spent afternoons with neighbors I had known for years, but never had enough time to visit. Slowly, my calendar began filling with people who seemed genuinely happy to see me. Then, sometime in early December, the first crack appeared. Ethan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded tired. After a few minutes of small talk, he asked if I would be available to watch the children during an upcoming weekend. In the past, I would have agreed immediately. I loved spending time with Lily and her brother. But that weekend, I already had plans with friends from the book club. I am sorry, I said kindly. I cannot this time. A brief silence followed. Ethan sounded surprised. Not offended, just surprised. As though it had never occurred to him that I might have a life that did not revolve around being available. A few weeks later, another request came. Then another. Each time, I responded honestly. Sometimes I was available. Sometimes I was not. For the first time, my schedule mattered too. What fascinated me was how quickly they noticed the change. Not because they missed my company. At least not yet. They noticed because certain conveniences were no longer guaranteed. The automatic support they had relied upon for years suddenly required a conversation, an effort, a relationship. One evening, after hanging up from another short phone call with Ethan, I sat quietly in my living room. Christmas lights glowed softly in the corner. Snow drifted past the windows outside. I realized I was no longer angry. Disappointed, yes. Sad sometimes, but not angry. The truth had removed the confusion. I finally understood where I stood. And once you stop begging people to see your value, something remarkable happens. You begin to see it yourself. By the time spring arrived, the shift in our relationship had become impossible to ignore. Not because I pointed it out, not because I demanded anything, simply because reality has a way of revealing itself when people can no longer rely on old patterns. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. He looked tired, older somehow. We sat at the kitchen table while sunlight spilled across the floor through the windows. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Then he sighed and rubbed his forehead. Things have been hectic lately, he admitted. I listened quietly. He explained that Jessica had accepted additional responsibilities at work. The children had become busier with school activities. Their schedules felt overwhelming. As he talked, I noticed something familiar. For years, I had quietly filled many of the gaps in their lives. School pickups, last-minute errands, birthday preparations, emergency babysitting, holiday planning, hundreds of small tasks that seemed invisible because they had always been handled. Now those tasks remained. The difference was that someone else had to manage them. Ethan never complained directly. He was too proud for that. But I could hear the strain beneath his words. What surprised me most was what happened next. The kids miss you, he said. I looked at him carefully. I miss them too. He nodded. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he added something that stayed with me. Lily keeps asking questions. I felt a small ache in my chest. What kind of questions? Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Questions I do not always know how to answer. A week later, I learned exactly what he meant. Ethan called one evening and asked if I could stop by their house for an hour. When I arrived, Lily was sitting at the dining room table surrounded by school supplies. She was working on a family history scrapbook for a class project. Photographs, drawings, and handwritten notes covered the table. She excitedly showed me each page. Then she opened a section labeled Family Traditions. My eyes drifted across the page until one sentence caught my attention. Written in careful 12-year-old handwriting were the words, "Grandma Margaret does not come to many family events because she likes being alone." For a moment, the room felt completely silent. Lily looked up innocently. That is what Mom always says. She smiled and continued organizing her papers, unaware of what she had just revealed. Across the room, I noticed Ethan standing near the kitchen doorway. He had heard every word. His expression changed instantly. Not anger, not disbelief. Recognition. The kind that arrives when dozens of scattered pieces finally connect. Later that evening, after Lily went upstairs, Ethan sat quietly at the table staring at the scrapbook page. She really believes that, he said softly. I nodded. Neither of us needed to explain where the idea came from. The sentence was almost identical to the comments Carol had heard. The same explanation Aunt Diane had repeated. The same narrative Jessica had posted in family group chats. For years, those words had traveled from relative to relative. Now they had reached Lily. The realization seemed to hit Ethan harder than anything else had. Not because it exposed Jessica, because it exposed how long the story had been allowed to grow unchecked. As I drove home that night beneath the fading light of sunset, I sensed something changing. Not in Jessica, not even in the family. In Ethan. For the first time, he was no longer hearing isolated comments. He was seeing the entire pattern. And once a person truly sees a pattern, it becomes impossible to pretend it is only a coincidence. The answer arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon near the end of summer. I was watering flowers on my front porch when Ethan's car pulled into the driveway. He stepped out alone. No Jessica. No children. Just Ethan. The moment I saw his face, I knew something was different. He looked tired, but there was something else too. A kind of heaviness I had not seen before. We sat at the kitchen table where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. For several minutes, neither of us spoke much. Finally, Ethan looked at me and sighed. Mom, I owe you an apology. I remained silent. He lowered his eyes to the table. Last week, Lily told me that Grandma does not like being with us. My chest tightened slightly. Ethan continued. When I asked her where she heard that, she said Jessica had told her many times. The room fell quiet. Outside, I could hear wind moving gently through the trees. Ethan stared at his hands before speaking again. At first, I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding. He shook his head slowly. But then I started thinking about everything. He told me how he had gone back through old messages, family group chats, emails, conversations he barely remembered having. He began noticing the same pattern I had discovered months earlier. The same explanations, the same assumptions, the same story repeated again and again. You prefer being alone. You do not enjoy crowds. You are slowing down. Ethan looked up at me. His eyes were filled with regret. I realized I had been accepting someone else's version of you for years. Hearing those words affected me more than I expected. Not because they fixed anything. They did not. But because they were honest. Completely honest. Ethan leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. The worst part is that I never questioned it. He paused. Every time Jessica explained your absence, I accepted it. Every time someone mentioned you were not coming, I assumed you had chosen not to. I never called. I never asked. The sadness in his voice felt genuine. For the first time, he was not defending himself. He was facing the truth. I kept choosing what was easy, he admitted quietly. And every time I did, it pushed you a little farther away. We sat together for a long moment. No accusations. No anger. There was no need for either. The facts were already sitting between us. Years could not be returned. Missed memories could not be recreated. Yet something important was happening. Ethan was finally seeing the difference between intention and responsibility. He may not have created the distance, but he had allowed it to grow. Before he left, he looked at me and said something I will never forget. You were always there for me. I just stopped showing up for you. I nodded slowly. Sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to hear. When Ethan stood and hugged me, I felt no triumph. No sense of victory. Only peace. Because this story was never really about proving someone wrong. It was about seeing clearly. After he drove away, I returned to my garden and finished watering the flowers. The evening sun painted long shadows across the yard. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet I felt lighter somehow. For years, I believed I was losing my place in my family. What I finally learned was something very different. I had never lost my value. I had only lost the illusion that other people were responsible for recognizing it. And once that illusion disappeared, I found something far more powerful waiting underneath. I found freedom.